Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. The day started as usual. I was standing by the stove, making breakfast. Eric was already getting ready for work, rustling papers at the kitchen table. I felt almost invisible in this house, like furniture that had long since become part of the decor. Eric and I had been together for over 10 years, and to be honest, much had become familiar and predictable over the years. A phone call pulled me out of my thoughts. Quickly wiping my hands on my apron, I went to the phone. The display showed a name, Mom. Sighing, I answered. "Hi, Mom," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Savannah, darling, how are you?" My mom's voice was unusually excited. "Everything's fine," I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "How are you?" "Wonderful. Listen, I have news. Daniel and I have decided to come visit you next week." I froze, feeling something cold tighten inside me. Daniel. I hadn't seen my stepfather in years, and to be honest, I wasn't sure I wanted that to change. His presence in my life had always brought a storm with it. Not always a bad one, but always emotional and complicated. "Mom, that's unexpected," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why all of a sudden?" "Well, we figured it's been a while since we've seen each other, and you did say you missed family gatherings." My mom laughed, as if it were the most wonderful idea in the world. "Besides, Daniel wants to see you too." "I see." I paused, trying to find words that wouldn't sound rude. "Of course, come. When are you planning to?" "Friday," Mom replied, pleased that I had agreed. "But don't worry, we won't stay long." "Okay, Mom, I'll take care of everything," I nodded, though she couldn't see me. When the call ended, I stared at the phone for a long time, feeling a strange tension. Why did they decide to visit now? What for? I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a coincidence, that there was no reason to worry. But something inside me told me this wasn't just happenstance. Eric noticed my unease. "Who was on the phone?" he asked, looking up from his papers. "Mom," I replied briefly. "She and Daniel are coming on Friday." Eric frowned. Something appeared on his face that I couldn't quite define. Whether it was concern or confusion, I wasn't sure. "Your stepfather?" "That Daniel?" he clarified, carefully choosing his words. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. Eric knew I had a complicated relationship with Daniel, but never asked too many questions. Perhaps because I rarely talked about him myself. "Well," he said after a pause, "I hope everything goes smoothly." I smiled weakly, not knowing what to say. Honestly, I wasn't sure what to expect from this visit either. The days until Friday flew by quickly, like a hurricane tearing leaves from trees. I busied myself cleaning the house, trying to distract myself from my thoughts, but the closer their arrival came, the more anxious I felt. On Friday evening, when I saw their car pull up to the house, my heart raced. Mom was the first to jump out, smiling and waving as if we hadn't been apart for years, but only for a few days. Daniel followed, his expression unreadable. "Hi, my dear." Mom rushed toward me, hugging me so tightly I could smell her favorite perfume. "I missed you so much." "I missed you too, Mom," I replied, but my eyes instinctively slid toward Daniel. He looked at me, and in his gaze, I couldn't read anything. No anger, no joy, just calmness, cold and detached. "Savannah?" He gave a short nod, and I did the same. As we entered the house, tension hung in the air. Eric tried to break the ice by offering tea and dinner. But every time I looked at Daniel, memories surfaced. His hands, his voice, his too attentive gaze that once made me feel small and vulnerable. During dinner, the conversations were formal. We talked about the weather, news in the town, but I knew these were just surface-level topics to avoid the real ones. Mom, as usual, was full of enthusiasm, sharing stories of her latest adventures. But each time she mentioned Daniel, I felt something tighten inside me. After dinner, When Eric went to the kitchen to do the dishes and Mom moved to the living room, Daniel approached me. His eyes were serious, looking directly into mine, as if trying to read my thoughts. "Savannah," he started quietly, "I know it's hard for you to see me after all these years, but I've come in peace." "In peace?" I repeated, feeling a wave of emotions rise within me. "Why are you here, Daniel?" "What do you want?" He smiled, slightly lifting the corners of his mouth, but his eyes remained serious. "Maybe just to talk?" he suggested. "You've changed so much, and yet stayed the same." "You've changed too," I snapped. "I'm just not sure it's for the better." He laughed, and I felt myself tense, not understanding what he found so amusing. "Perhaps," he replied, "but I'm glad we've met again. We have much to talk about." I wanted to respond, but the words stuck in my throat. His presence affected me like an electric shock, stirring a mix of anger, anxiety, and something else, something forbidden that I didn't want to admit even to myself. "We'll see," I muttered, turning away. "We'll see." We stood next to each other in this house that suddenly felt foreign to me, and I knew this visit would not be as simple as I had hoped. At that moment, I didn't yet realize that this was just the beginning of something that would change my entire life. I didn't expect the first evening of my mother's and Daniel's visit to turn out the way it did. The initial plan was to spend time at home, have dinner, so everyone could relax and talk. But then Eric suddenly suggested a different idea. "Hey," he said after dinner, when we were all sitting in the living room, "what if we go to that new rooftop bar that just opened downtown? They have live music tonight, and our friends are heading there." I looked at him in surprise. I knew Eric was trying to find something to ease the tension, but a rooftop bar? An evening with friends? With Daniel in tow? It felt strange, to say the least. But before I could respond, my mom nodded enthusiastically. "Great idea!" she exclaimed. "Daniel and I haven't been to a place like that in a while. It'll be fun." I nodded, not wanting to spoil the mood, and forced a smile. After all, maybe it would help to diffuse the tension. Or maybe I just needed to stop overthinking everything. By the time we arrived at the bar, it was dark. The rooftop was bustling, people were laughing, live music played. A jazz band was performing something light and cheerful, and the scent of fresh cocktails filled the air. The city, lit up by its myriad lights, stretched before us like a giant map. Eric greeted his friends with a smile. He quickly started an easy conversation with Mark and his girlfriend Laura. Mom also blended into the group effortlessly, laughing and sharing stories with new acquaintances. I, on the other hand, couldn't relax. I scanned the crowd for Daniel, and there he was, standing at the edge of the rooftop, gazing out at the city. I approached him, grabbing a glass of juice, trying to seem calm. "How do you like it here?" I asked, joining him. "Surprisingly pleasant," he answered with a faint smile, not turning his head. I didn't expect Eric to suggest a place like this. "Yeah, it is a bit odd," I agreed, feeling my shoulders tense. "I think he just wants everyone to relax." Daniel turned to me, his gaze warm but probing. "And are you relaxed, Savannah?" he asked unexpectedly. I felt my cheeks flush. "Not really," I admitted honestly. "Too many memories." "That's not always a bad thing," he noted, leaning back against the railing. "Memories help us understand who we've become." "Or who we never wanted to become," I retorted, trying to mask my unease. Daniel laughed. His laugh was soft, almost private, as if he understood something I hadn't yet realized. "You know, I'm glad we've met again," he said after a pause. "We have a lot of unfinished business." I didn't have time to reply, as Eric, noticing us, walked over with 2 glasses in hand. "Join us," he offered with a strained smile. "We're talking about plans for the weekend." "Of course," Daniel replied, quickly shifting his expression to something more amicable. "We'd love to." Eric wrapped his arm around my waist, his hand warm and familiar, but I sensed tension in his movements. "How's your evening?" he asked quietly, leaning closer to my ear. "Fine," I lied, feeling my fingers tighten around my glass. "A little strange, though." "Strange?" Eric smirked, but I saw the concern in his eyes. "Is Daniel acting like usual, or is it just me?" "I don't know, Eric," I mumbled, not wanting to continue the conversation. He's just, he's just Daniel." Eric nodded, but I knew he had noticed my unease. At some point, he let go of me and walked over to talk to Mark. I felt a tightness inside. Something wasn't right. We sat down at a large round table, and the conversations gradually turned to more personal topics. Mark talked about his plans for a new business. Laura shared funny stories from her job in advertising, and everyone joked and laughed. I tried to focus on their words, but my gaze occasionally drifted toward Daniel. He was watching me, calmly, without any emotion on his face, but his gaze was intent. Eric noticed it and started asking questions to distract attention, but I felt his arm tighten around my shoulder. "How are things between you and Daniel, Savannah?" Mark suddenly asked, clearly trying to lighten the mood. "Between us?" I repeated, a bit bewildered. "Everything's fine. We just haven't seen each other in a while." "Well," Mark chuckled, "maybe that's for the best. Sometimes reunions with the past can be beneficial." "Or painful," Daniel added, squinting slightly. I felt Eric tense beside me. "Ah, I think we should leave it at that," Eric said quietly, but his voice was firm. Daniel gave a slight smile and raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, looking directly into my eyes. I didn't know what to say. Everything felt too tense, too personal. I felt my head spinning from all the thoughts swirling in my mind, and, grabbing my glass, I took a sip. At that moment, I thought I heard someone from the crowd start singing to the accompaniment of the live music. The atmosphere lightened a bit, and I tried to relax. But inside, something was still churning, something tied to Daniel's presence. We stayed at the bar for a few more hours. As we left, Eric held my hand tightly. I knew he was starting to suspect something, that thoughts were forming in his mind that I didn't want to see take shape. Daniel said goodbye to us politely, but there was something in his gaze that made my heart beat faster. That night, I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. Daniel's words kept echoing in my mind, his cryptic comments, his gaze that seemed to pierce into the deepest parts of my soul. I knew that something was changing, that something was beginning. I just didn't know what it would mean for me, for Eric, for all of us. Eric turned toward me in bed, his breathing steady, but I knew he wasn't asleep either. "Savannah," he called softly. "Are you okay?" I sighed, trying to find the words that would reassure him, but all I could say was, "I don't know, Eric. I just don't know." The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness on my heart. The night had been restless, and the thoughts of the previous evening at the bar wouldn't leave me in peace. Memories of my conversation with Daniel kept swirling in my head, his comments, and of course, his gaze. That gaze was too intense, too personal. Eric noticed my unease, but didn't ask unnecessary questions. He simply left me alone when he went to work, as if he understood that I needed time to sort myself out. When I went downstairs, there was a note from Mom on the kitchen table. "Daniel and I went for a walk. See you later." She even drew a smiley face at the end, as if trying to make the message more cheerful. I felt something tighten inside me. For some reason, I knew this walk wouldn't be just a simple stroll for me. A little later, the phone rang. I glanced at the screen. Daniel. "Hi, Savannah." His voice was calm, almost friendly. "I was wondering if you'd like to meet me in the park. You could use some fresh air." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. My heart started beating faster, and my throat went dry. "Why?" I asked, trying to keep my composure. "Just to talk," he answered softly. "We haven't seen each other in a while, and I'd like to reminisce about old times." I didn't know what made me agree. Maybe curiosity, maybe that internal conflict that had been eating away at me. But within an hour, I was standing in the park we used to visit so often during my teenage years. This park was filled with memories, and though I never admitted it to myself, it always held a special place in my heart. When I reached the central path, Daniel was already waiting. He stood near the spot where the old skate ramp used to be, a place we used to frequent so many years ago. He smiled when he saw me and raised his hand in greeting. "Hi," I said quietly as I approached. "Hi," he replied. "Do you remember how we used to spend time here? How you tried to pull off your first trick and fell every time?" I involuntarily laughed. The memories flooded back. Yes, I remembered how it was. How I was this determined but clumsy girl, always trying to prove something to myself and to him. How Daniel, patient and restrained, taught me to skateboard, laughed at my failures, but always helped me get back up. "Yeah, I remember," I answered with a smirk. "And I remember how you always teased me." "I wasn't teasing," he countered, smiling slightly. "I just wanted you not to be afraid of falling. It makes us stronger." "Maybe," I sighed, looking at the old ramp, now covered in rust and graffiti. "But a lot has changed since then." "But some things stayed the same," he quietly added, and his eyes met mine again. I felt a wave of emotions rising inside me. Too many feelings at once: memories, fear, a strange kind of excitement. We stood in silence for a few seconds, looking at each other. Then he took a step closer. "Savannah, I'm not trying to go back to the past," he said softly, almost in a whisper. "I just want to understand what happened. Why did we become so distant?" I felt my heart stop for a moment. All these years, I had avoided thinking about it. I had tried to convince myself that it was all behind me, that I was moving forward. But now, standing in front of him, I could no longer run from these questions. "Daniel," I started, but the words got stuck in my throat. "We shouldn't talk about this. It's wrong." He took another step forward, and now I could feel his breath. It was warm and quiet, like a summer breeze. "Why is it wrong?" he asked gently. "What's so bad about it?" I didn't know how to respond. Too many emotions and memories filled my head. I felt his hand touch mine, and to my own surprise, I didn't pull away. His touch was familiar, and yet new, forbidden. "Because we have lives now," I whispered, trying not to meet his eyes. "I have a life." "And are you happy?" he asked. His voice was soft, but there was a slight challenge in it. I remained silent. The question was too direct. Am I happy? When was the last time I asked myself that question? Suddenly, he leaned in closer, and before I could process what was happening, his lips touched mine. It was a moment that lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. At first, I froze, but then I felt something inside me respond. It was like returning to the past, like a flash of memories I had tried to forget. I pulled back abruptly, breaking the kiss. My heart was pounding wildly. "Daniel, no!" I said, breathing heavily. "This is wrong. We can't." "Why not?" he asked quietly. "Why can't we just be honest with ourselves?" "Because it would destroy everything we have now," I replied, feeling my eyes fill with tears. "You don't understand. I can't do this." He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw a mixture of emotions: regret, desire, confusion. "All right," he finally said, stepping back slightly. "I don't want to push you, Savannah. I just want you to know that I'm here. I'm always here." I nodded, not knowing what else to say. My hands were trembling, and I felt as lost as I did the first time I stood on a skateboard. I I have to go," I said, turning away from him. "I need to think." "Of course," he replied quietly. "Take your time." I quickly walked away, not looking back, though each step felt like a struggle. There was a heaviness in my chest, as if something was pressing down on it from the inside. I knew one thing: this kiss, that moment, had already changed something in my life. and I needed to figure out exactly what. After my meeting with Daniel in the park, I felt, to put it mildly, lost. My thoughts were scattered, and I couldn't find peace. It seemed like something in my life had suddenly cracked, and I was standing at the edge of that crack, unsure where to step next. I felt drawn to Daniel, but I knew it was a dangerous path, one that could destroy everything Eric and I had built over the years. But I couldn't escape these thoughts. Eric, of course, noticed something was off. He had always been attentive to me, even if I didn't always realize it. Over the next few days, he started watching me more closely, as if trying to read my mind. I avoided his gaze, stayed away from long conversations, and often found excuses to leave the house, for a jog, to the store, or just for a walk. I needed to be alone to figure things out. One evening, after yet another unexpected visit to a friend, I returned home to find Eric in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table, his eyes fixed on a newspaper, but I could tell right away that he wasn't reading. His shoulders were tense, and his expression was focused. "Hey," I greeted him, trying to sound casual. "How was your day?" "Not bad," he answered shortly without looking up. "And yours?" "All good," I replied, avoiding his gaze but sensing his tension. "You've been going out a lot lately," he said suddenly, his voice slightly strained. "Is everything okay?" I froze, trying not to show my anxiety. "Yeah, of course," I answered quickly. "I just need a little time to myself, you know." Eric lifted his eyes and looked at me with a seriousness I rarely saw in him. "Of course I understand," he said, though his voice lacked full conviction. "But I'm worried, Savannah. You're acting differently, like you're hiding something." I felt a wave of panic rise inside me. He was beginning to suspect something. I tried to smile to reassure both him and myself. "No, everything's fine," I assured him. "I guess I'm just tired, that's all." Eric nodded, but it seemed like he wasn't fully satisfied with my answer. There was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, and I knew he wouldn't just let it go. A couple of days later, Eric approached me with an idea. "I've been thinking," he began cautiously. "Maybe we should spend more time together. How about a barbecue in the park this weekend? I'll invite Mark and Laura, and we can have a nice time, relax." I immediately understood that this was his attempt to bring us back to normal. He wanted things to be like they used to be, but to me, it felt like I was already too far from that normal. "That's a good idea," I said, trying not to reveal my inner tension. "I think it'll be fun." Eric smiled, but his eyes remained watchful. I knew this was a test for him, and I had to play my role as best I could. Yet, inside, I felt a growing unease. It seemed like we were no longer the same as before, that an invisible wall had grown between us, and with each passing day, that wall was getting higher. On the weekend, we went to the park. It was a familiar spot where we often went with friends, a spacious clearing surrounded by trees, with several picnic tables and grills. Mark and Laura were already there waiting for us, and when we arrived, they greeted us with smiles. "Hey, guys!" Mark exclaimed happily, giving Eric a hug. "Long time no see, how's it going?" "Great," Eric replied, trying to sound cheerful. "Just thought we'd get out and relax a bit." I smiled at Laura, trying to act natural. We started unpacking the food, and Eric busied himself with the grill. He looked focused, but I knew his thoughts were far from just making barbecue. I could sense his unease. Mark and Laura brought a guitar, and soon we were all sitting by the grill, singing old songs and laughing. I tried to act natural, but every smile felt forced. I could feel Eric watching me, observing my every move. At some point, Mark suggested we play a game, asking each other questions to learn something new. It was lighthearted and friendly, but I knew Eric would use this opportunity to try to understand what was going on in my head. "All right, Savannah," Mark began with a grin. "Tell us, if you could spend one day anywhere, with anyone, what would it be?" I tensed. The question was harmless, but it hit a sensitive chord. "I'd probably just spend the day with Eric." I answered quickly, trying not to show my discomfort. Somewhere beautiful, maybe at the beach. Eric smiled, but I could see that his eyes remained guarded. He noticed my unease. And you, Eric? Laura asked right away, trying to keep the conversation going. Eric paused for a moment. I'd like to spend the day somewhere in the mountains, away from everything, he said, looking at me. Just being with nature and the people I love. His answer sounded like he was searching for something important, something that would help him understand what was happening between us. The game went on, and I tried to stay engaged, but all the while, I felt like I was on the verge of breaking. At one point, I excused myself, saying I needed to freshen up, and walked over to a small pond nearby. I heard Eric ask Mark, "Do you think she's okay?" His voice sounded worried. Mark, being the good friend he was, tried to reassure him. "Yeah, man. She's probably just tired or something. You know, everyone has those days." But I knew Eric didn't believe him. He sensed something was wrong, and now he was trying to figure it out. And it felt like my secrets were slowly, but surely, starting to surface. When I returned, Eric came over, placed a hand on my shoulder, and quietly asked, "Savannah, if something's wrong, will you tell me?" I nodded, though inside, I was boiling with emotion. I knew my lies wouldn't last much longer, but I didn't know how to stop it. How to turn things back when everything had already started to change? Eric smiled, but in his eyes, I saw determination. A determination to find out the truth. And maybe, for me, that was more terrifying than any other outcome. A week had passed since our barbecue in the park, but my mind was still in chaos. I continued to feel tension in my relationship with Eric. He had become even more cautious and attentive to my actions, and I knew he suspected something. And then there was Daniel. He had reappeared in my life so suddenly that I hadn't had time to process anything. Now Daniel had found another way to be close again. "Hey, Savannah," he called one afternoon when I was home alone. "How are you?" I froze for a moment. His voice still had that effect on me, stirring a mix of anxiety and curiosity. "Hi," I replied, trying to sound calm. "I'm fine, I guess. What's up?" "Nothing special," he said with a slight smile in his voice. "I just thought, maybe you'd like to join us at the beach. We're getting a group together to play volleyball. It'll be fun." A wave of doubt rose inside me. Why was he inviting me again? Why was he arranging all these meetings? But at the same time, I felt curiosity. I wanted to know what he was up to. "I'm not sure," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Maybe it's not the best idea?" "Savannah," he replied gently. "It's just a game. You used to love volleyball, remember? Let's just relax, like old times." His words touched me. I really did love volleyball, and we used to play often when I was younger. And maybe I did need a little distraction. "All right," I sighed, making up my mind. "I'll come." When I arrived at the beach, there were already a lot of people. I saw Daniel standing with some familiar faces and waved at him. He smiled back, and I felt a slight flutter of excitement. "Glad you came," he said, walking over. "I see you still like staying active." "Yeah," I smiled, trying to hide my nervousness. "I haven't played volleyball in a while. It'll be interesting to see if I still remember how." The game started. We split into teams, and I tried to focus on the ball, not on the thoughts swirling in my head. I felt Daniel's gaze, his presence, even when he was on the other side of the net. Every time our eyes met, I felt a strange excitement. He smiled at me, and I tried to smile back, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Eric. Eric. How would he react if he knew I was here with Daniel? I knew it would hurt him. And yet, I kept playing. At one point, when I served the ball, I felt Daniel come closer. "Nice shot," he said quietly, and I felt his breath near me. "You're still good at this." I nodded, feeling my cheeks flush slightly. "Thanks," I whispered, avoiding his gaze. The game went on, but with each hit, I felt the tension between us grow. At one point, we collided trying to reach the ball, and I ended up in his arms, even if only for a moment. I felt his touch, gentle but firm, and in that instant, everything else faded away. Careful, he whispered, letting go. I don't want you to get hurt. I just nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but felt like an eternity to me. After the game, we all sat on the sand, exchanging jokes and laughing. I tried to act natural, but inside, everything was in turmoil. Daniel stayed close to me, and his presence made me increasingly uneasy. When I finally decided to leave, he came over to me. You look anxious, he said quietly. Is everything okay? Yeah, I'm fine, I lied, knowing full well that I wasn't. Savannah. He looked into my eyes. I want you to know that I'm not here to ruin your life, but I can't pretend there's nothing between us. I didn't know what to say. I felt everything inside me screaming with contradictions, but I couldn't find the words. I have to go, I said finally, feeling like I couldn't stand next to him any longer. He nodded, released my hand, and looked at me with a strange tenderness. All right, but I don't want you running from yourself. When I got home, Eric was there. He was sitting at the table, and I immediately sensed that he was deep in thought. His face was serious, and his eyes were tense. Where have you been? He asked as I walked in. I was with some friends, I replied, trying to appear nonchalant. What friends? His voice was cold, and I realized he already suspected something. Just friends, I muttered, trying to avoid answering. Savannah, his voice became more insistent. I can see you're not telling me the truth, and I can't take it anymore. I began to notice changes in Eric. He became more withdrawn, started conversations less often, and frequently looked away when I spoke to him. It seemed as though an invisible wall had formed between us, and I couldn't understand what had caused it. He must have suspected something after our conversation about the detective, but I had no idea what he was planning. Those days were filled with anxiety and tension. Every morning, as I woke up, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. Each time Eric came home from work, I feared he would bring up what had happened. What would I tell him? Should I confess that I had met with Daniel? Or should I keep lying for as long as I could? One evening, as I sat in the kitchen, contemplating my next move, Eric suddenly came home earlier than usual. He looked serious and focused. His face seemed darker somehow. My heart started to race. Hi, I said, trying to hide my nervousness. How was your day? Eric didn't respond. Instead, he silently walked to the cabinet, grabbed a glass, and poured himself some water. Then he sat across from me at the table, staring at me intently. I sensed that something important was about to happen, something that could change everything. I hired a detective, he finally spoke quietly, but there was tension in his voice. He sent me something. I froze, unable to move. My fingers involuntarily gripped the edge of the table. What did he send? I asked, trying to stay calm. Without breaking eye contact, Eric slowly pulled an envelope out of his jacket pocket and placed it on the table in front of me. See for yourself, he said coldly. I cautiously opened the envelope, my hands trembling as I pulled out several photographs. Eric's gaze remained fixed on my face as I looked at the pictures, and my heart sank. In the photos, I saw Daniel and me at the waterfront, where we had gone for karaoke. At first, we were standing side by side, smiling, but then, in one shot, our lips were locked in a kiss. I felt the blood drain from my face. Everything inside me turned upside down. This isn't what it looks like, I stammered, realizing how ridiculous those words sounded. Eric laughed, but there was no joy in his laugh. It was a bitter, nervous, almost painful sound. Not what it looks like? He repeated. Savannah, do you think I'm blind? Do you think I can't see what's going on? I searched for an excuse, words that could explain this, but all I could do was open my mouth, unable to say anything. How long has this been going on? Eric continued, his voice cold as ice. How long have you been lying to me? It's not what you think, I repeated, feeling tears well up in my eyes. It was a mistake, just once. A mistake, he exclaimed, his face turning red with anger. A mistake that's been going on all this time? Do you think I'm an idiot? I didn't know what to say. The words wouldn't come. They were stuck in my throat. I realized I couldn't hide the truth any longer, but how could I explain everything? Eric, I don't know how it happened, I finally muttered. Everything got so complicated, and I didn't know what to do. Complicated? Eric raised his eyebrows, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. You didn't know what to do, so you decided to betray me? His voice grew louder, and I felt something tighten inside me. I didn't want this to happen, I said, unable to hold back my tears. I got confused. I wasn't myself. Not yourself? He interrupted. You were confused? Are you telling me that kissing Daniel was just an impulse? One of those things that just happen? I couldn't look him in the eye. I could feel his pain, his anger, his sense of betrayal. I knew that whatever I said now could only make things worse, but staying silent felt unbearable. Eric, I'm sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I never wanted to hurt you. Things just got out of control. Out of control? His voice became quiet, but in that tone, I heard more anger than in his shouting. How could you let this get out of control? He stood up abruptly from his chair, so suddenly that I flinched. I always thought we could be honest with each other, he said, raising his hands slowly. That, no matter what, we could trust each other. But now, I don't even know who you are. His words cut through me. He had never spoken to me like this, had never expressed such disappointment and bitterness. Eric, please, let me explain. I tried to approach him, but he stepped back. Don't touch me, he said coldly. I don't want to hear any more explanations. Everything's clear, Savannah. I stood frozen, feeling the tears stream down my cheeks. I couldn't believe things had gone this far, that we had reached this point. What now? I whispered, almost not believing my own voice. Eric turned to me, his eyes full of pain. Now, he said slowly, I don't know. But I do know one thing. I need time. And maybe you do too. He left, leaving me standing in the kitchen, holding the photos that had become my sentence. I stood there, feeling my legs give way beneath me, and my soul tear apart. Now everything was exposed. No more secrets, no more illusions. And I knew that our marriage, our life, would never be the same again. Eric left, and I remained standing in the kitchen, as if in a daze. Time seemed to stand still, and the silence in the house became unbearable. I looked at the photographs I held in my hands and felt their cold, coarse paper burning my fingers. Each image, each frozen moment seemed to pierce me through, as if repeating over and over, "This is how you betrayed his trust." Tears streamed down my cheeks, but I barely registered them. I knew I had made a terrible mistake, but I hadn't thought it would go this far. My guilt seemed so glaringly obvious that I couldn't even imagine how to explain my actions to Eric. But I couldn't let him leave. I couldn't just give up and watch everything we had built together crumble. A few hours later, Eric returned. He was somber and composed. I immediately knew that he had made an important decision. His face conveyed cold determination. Eric, please, let's talk, I said as he entered the house. My words sounded desperate, almost pleading. I know I made a mistake. I know you're hurting deeply right now. But we can fix everything. I am ready to do whatever it takes to regain your trust. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. There was no anger in his eyes, only deep, disappointed fatigue. Savannah, he began quietly, but his voice was firm. I can't. I can't fix this. I can't live with it. Please don't say that. I moved closer to him, trying to touch his hand, but he pulled away. I know it was terrible, that I made a huge mistake, but it was just a mistake. A momentary lapse, nothing more. I love you, Eric, only you. He shook his head, and I felt my heart constrict. Love? He repeated, his voice full of bitterness. You call this love? Savannah, I always thought love was trust, fidelity, the choice to stay with the person you chose once every day. You made a choice, and it wasn't in my favor. And now, I have to accept it. I felt something inside me tearing apart. All I wanted was to get him back, to regain his love, his trust. I couldn't accept that it would all disappear. Eric, please! I tried to reach out to him again, hoping he would soften. We can start over. I will do whatever is needed. Just don't leave. He sighed, and I saw his face tighten. Savannah, he said, looking me straight in the eyes. I've already made my decision. I can't live with you knowing you betrayed me. Every time I look at you, I will remember this. It eats away at me from the inside. I don't want to live with this pain. Are you filing for divorce? I asked, feeling the emptiness growing in my chest. He nodded. Yes, I'm filing for divorce. I've already found a lawyer, he said in a steady voice. And I want you to know that this is not just a decision made in the heat of the moment. I thought about it all night and realized I can't continue living this lie. I felt the world around me start to crumble. Everything I knew, everything that was important to me, seemed to vanish in an instant. Please, Eric, give me a chance. I couldn't hold back my tears. I'm ready to work on our relationship. I can't imagine my life without you. He just shook his head. Savannah, sometimes it's too late. I tried to forgive you, honestly tried, but I can't. It's stronger than me. I'm not the kind of person who can forget. His voice was resolute and unfeeling. You made your choice, and I have to make mine. I looked at him, feeling everything inside me collapse. I wanted him to change his mind, to give me a chance, but I knew he had already made up his mind. All right, I whispered, trying to hold back my sobs. If you've decided, I won't insist. Eric nodded and stood up, as if ready to leave forever. We can do this peacefully, he added. I don't want to make a scene. I just want to part ways without any complications. I nodded silently. Words caught in my throat. It seemed pointless to speak now. I knew he wouldn't back down from his decision. He had always been like that. Once he made up his mind, nothing could change it. The next day, I started packing my things. I knew that if I stayed, I would only continue to destroy myself. Our home no longer felt like my own. It had become a place where all my mistakes were on display, like wounds that refused to heal. I understood that I needed to leave. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving. I simply wrote a short note to Eric. I need time. I'm leaving. Don't look for me. I'm sorry for everything. And I left. I took the car, threw a few things in it, and drove out of town. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to be away from everything that reminded me of the pain, of what I had lost. I wanted to find myself, understand who I was now, that everything I cherished had been destroyed. I hoped that a new life, a new city, would help me start fresh, figure out what to do next. I drove down a deserted road, feeling the wind blowing through my hair, and understood that the unknown awaited me ahead. But at the same time, that unknown seemed like the only chance to save myself, the only opportunity to find myself again. Several weeks had passed since I left the city. I had thought that leaving everything familiar behind and starting over would be easier than it turned out to be. I naively believed that if I moved far away, I could leave my pain and regrets behind. But they turned out to be unwelcome passengers, traveling with me, sitting beside me. I rented a small apartment in another city. The place was nondescript, almost empty. White walls, an old couch, a solitary table. I tried not to bring too many of my belongings, as if that would help me not to get attached, not to settle in for too long. But deep down, I knew my escape had been futile. I couldn't run away from what was happening inside me. In the first days, I simply tried to exist. Each morning began the same way. I got out of bed, looked out the window at the unfamiliar people passing by, and felt a tightening of loneliness inside me. I tried to keep myself occupied, looked for a job, but it seemed like no one would hire me in the state I was in, torn apart. One day, sitting in a small cafe around the corner, I realized I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't just sit and wait for life to sort itself out. I had to do something. I decided to apply for a job at the local library. Books had always been my refuge, and I hoped that perhaps, surrounded by books, I might find something akin to peace. Days dragged on slowly, as if time had slowed down specifically to make me feel every minute of my regret and guilt. Each day, I replayed in my mind the moments when I could have acted differently, when I could have stopped, could have said no. But each time, I realized it no longer mattered. I had made my choice, and now I had to live with its consequences. One evening, I sat by the lake, a place I often visited after work. The water was calm, reflecting the setting sun, and the air was filled with the scent of freshness and freedom. I thought about how much I had lost, about how the love I had once considered unbreakable had crumbled due to one foolish, thoughtless decision. Eric. His face constantly resurfaced in my thoughts, his disappointed look when he learned of my betrayal, his words full of pain and bitterness. How could I have inflicted such pain on him? I tried to justify myself, but I knew there was no justification for what I had done. I didn't know where he was now. Perhaps he was also trying to start anew, leaving everything behind. I hoped he had found a way to heal, to find happiness, or maybe he was suffering too, just as I was. The thought tore me apart. Every day was a struggle. I woke up with a weight on my heart, and every night I fell asleep with the same heaviness. Sometimes I felt like I couldn't endure it, that the pain would never go away. But I knew it was my price to pay for what I had done. I had destroyed everything I had. In an attempt to find my place, I started interacting with new people. I made a few acquaintances at work, went out to lunch with them, occasionally attended parties. But even in their company, I felt like an outsider. It seemed like they saw something wrong in me, that they sensed my inner emptiness. No one knew the burden I carried, but I felt it every moment. One day, walking along the waterfront, I saw a couple. They were holding hands, laughing and chatting. Something in their gestures reminded me of Eric and me in better times. Times when we were happy, when nothing stood between us. My chest filled with longing and regret, and I realized that even if I could start over, this wound would remain forever. Several more weeks passed, and one day I realized I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't just continue going with the flow, not knowing what would come next. I decided that I needed to take a step forward, a decisive action. I couldn't just sit and suffer. I sat down at the table, took a pen and paper, and began to write. I wrote a letter to Eric. The words came slowly, each one filled with the pain I felt. Eric, I don't know where you are now or how you are, but I need to tell you what I didn't manage to say before. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you, for the disappointment you felt. I've realized what a terrible mistake I made. I tried to start a new life, but I realized it's impossible to just forget. I'm not expecting your forgiveness. I know it might never come, but I want you to know that I sincerely regret everything that happened. You deserve better, and I hope you find the happiness I couldn't give you. With love, Savannah. I put the letter in an envelope and sent it, not knowing if it would reach him. But I needed to do it, if only to release a little of the weight from my heart. Life in the new city continued. I gradually adjusted to the new rhythm, found the strength to move forward, but I knew it was only the beginning of a long path to healing. I didn't know where this path would end, but now I was ready to follow it, despite all the difficulties. I stood at the threshold of a new life, full of uncertainty, and knew one thing. I would no longer try to run away from myself. I would face whatever came next, because it was the only way to find peace in my soul.